I mean, one of the things that is interesting as a teacher is you get to see a lot of kids and a lot of generations. Like you say, it's hard for you to kind of think back because there's so much time that you've taught.
Mhm.
Um, would you say that the kids have always been the same, or would you say that there's been sort of a change in society and watching the kids change, watch society change through the kids as you're teaching them, or is it parental influence?
Well, that's a good question, Andy. That's a really thoughtful question. You guys got to remember when I quit teaching in 2003, they had flip phones. They may have had the iPhone.
Right.
But I mean, I remember I got the first computer, me and Mick Ireland got the first computer in Aspen High School in like 1978 or 79. So that's,
Like a K Pro or something, isn't it?
huh?
K Pro or something?
Yeah, that's Conroe had that.
Mhm.
I had
Yeah.
just some kind of generic. We went down. There's some guy on Main Street selling them in the basement of the shop. Mick knew about computers. You know, he's a math guy. And did I say Mick Ireland? I didn't mean Mick Ireland. I mean, what was Mick's last name? Oh well, this math teacher, Mick. And we're down about two computers. You know how it was. You put the floppy disk in the top for your Word Perfect. It wasn't Microsoft Word, it was Word
Right.
Perfect.
Yeah.
And the DOS disk in the bottom, type. Okay. Then you pulled out the Word Perfect disk and saved it on a blank disk when you wanted to save your document. All right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, that's how primitive it was. And that's 1978. And the reason I mentioned or 9. So the reason I mentioned that is because the kids didn't have cell phones and laptops. And, you know, you guys remember, you took your notes in a notebook.
Yeah.
You might remember I printed out outlines and gave you the outlines because I thought, why are they spending all their time writing this stuff down when all they have to do is look at an outline and remember 1492, there it is. Okay, done. You don't have to write it down, right? So anyway, I actually get really upset when people diss kids.
Yeah.
I've had people say, oh yeah, we can't hire these kids. They're a bunch of, they don't want to work. Now maybe you guys have found differently because you're business entrepreneurs. So, but I get upset because I find, I mean, young people care about global warming. They care about their rights being taken away. They care about, you know, a lot of things. And I found that kids were idealistic. You guys were idealistic when you were young.
Mhm.
You might have been idealistic about different things, and maybe perhaps different than I would be concerned about. But young people, generally speaking, I'm generalizing,
Mhm.
give a darn. You know, I think intuitively, you kind of go, okay, I'm 18. If I'm lucky, I'm going to live to be in my 80s. What the heck's the world going to look like in 2050 or whatever, you know, or 2060?
Mhm.
And I'd be scared if I was them. I'd be nervous. You know, I mean.
Well, I just remember going to the ISIS Theater and seeing 2001 and thinking that was so far down the line.
Yeah.
And now, you know, we're not living in spaceships. We're not, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's like, and so I feel like there's sort of a disconnect. Personally, I feel like a lot of the issues that people have, what you're talking about to me is blame. Everybody likes to blame something because they don't want to take responsibility for it. I feel like there's one of the big issues that I sense, whether it's kids or parents, it's about tradition. It's about it, not so much tradition like old things, but
Conventional wisdom.
respect and honor for a system and a process of things, you know, as opposed to the instantaneous stuff. But that's also in parents, not just kids, you know.
Well, I agree, but here's the deal for the history teacher. You asked me really good questions. So, okay, I became a history teacher because of Watergate, the Civil Rights Movement, and Vietnam. I moved from London, England, my dad was in the Air Force, to Biloxi, Mississippi in 1960, Two, when I moved to Biloxi, Mississippi, black people tried to swim in the ocean and got the heck beat out of them with baseball bats. All right, that's what Mississippi was like. So Watergate, Vietnam, I went to Vietnam. It was a useless, just in my opinion. Somebody else who listens to this will say, oh no, he doesn't know what he's talking about. It was a useless war. In fact, I got out of the Army because I was teaching, like I said, at the Mountain Ranger School. And I thought, I'm training all these guys to go to Vietnam. I don't like this. I don't like killing people. I don't like people trying to kill me. And I certainly don't like, I didn't like people killing me. And I didn't like being responsible. You remember, if you're an officer, somebody gets killed, it's your fault.
Right.
Right? I mean, and you kind of feel bad, right? Oh shit, I screwed up on that ambush and this guy got killed. Well, that doesn't make you feel good. So I got out of the Army for that reason. But I want to see if I can go in here without rambling.
I was gonna add to that and say, George, I gotta say, probably the most impactful single moment in anybody high school that went through high school during your time was when you opened up your chest and brought up all that stuff and you shared all that stuff with folks, because it's, people tell you stuff and they can and you can hear all this stuff and it's usually spin and all kinds of different things and conspiracy this and that and whatever. But when you hear from someone who is like, oh yeah, and they're pulling stuff out, memorabilia from there that they brought.
That's from my slides.
It's real. Do you know what I mean? And,
I'm happy you made an impact.
You did make an impact on a lot of kids.
Because I didn't want you guys to go.
Right.
I didn't want you guys fighting in Iraq or Afghanistan or wherever the next war is going to be, And I really am happy. By the way, just in case you want to know, Trump is talking about reinstating the draft. So yeah, I saw your kid in the background there, Chris. Good luck. Chris, good luck. But war sucks. And since you're talking about the olden days, when I was a kid, when I was your age, when you were in high school, remember, guys, I was born in 1943. World War II, it ended in 1945. So when I was a teenager, when Elvis came on the scene, I was like 13 years old.
Right.
All right? My dad hated Elvis. All his friends hated Elvis. Chris, you mentioned the Beatles. They didn't like the Beatles. You know what I mean? Yeah. And so we had a really, really rough, the 60s was tough, man. I think perhaps it's been glamorized. Oh yeah, the hippies, free love, sex, drugs, and rock and roll. But it was hard. All the guys were worried about being drafted, because we met, like Coach D was in the Army. Frank Beer was in the Army. Bob Simons was in the Army. Yeah. I was in the Army. If you were a guy, unless you lucked out, you had to serve, But you guys didn't have to worry about that.
No, my dad, first the rules were if you were in college. So my dad was okay because he was in college.
Yeah.
But then they changed the rules and you had to have a kid. So then I came along, just so happened I came along. So my dad was okay with that. Then they changed the rules where it wasn't just one kid, you had to have two kids, and my brother came along. So it was like he just managed to sift through and not have to worry about that.
I mean, but he did worry about it.
Oh no, he worried about it, yeah.
He did. He was smart enough to realize, I don't want to do this. This is not a just war, and plus he didn't want to probably get killed. So he went, okay, so, that's kind of a hard reason to have a kid.
Yeah.
If you think about it, well, let's see. I can go to combat, I can go to war, or I can have a child. Okay, I'll pick one,
Well, I think actually in our situation, he was lucky. It just so happened my mom got pregnant.
Right.
And I think it just sort of, that's, you never can plan any of that stuff. It just sort of happens sometimes, but it's definitely, it was an impact on the generation. And that's one thing too, that's very interesting is, every generation always says, oh, well, my generation had it really bad and this is so bad. And it's like, well, there's the Vietnam War, there's the Korean War, there's World War II, there's Afghanistan, there's, now you got Gaza. It's like Ukraine. I mean, yeah, I mean, and then there's things like Darfur that's constantly going on. I mean, that's probably 40 years that Darfur has been going on.
What's Darfur?
Darfur in Africa.
Oh yeah.
I mean, it's basically a bunch of rebels or drug dealers fighting it out in the jungle.
Yeah. Well, I to go back to what your original question, like, what do I think about children, young people today? They don't have it easier. They don't have it easier. I mean, if you're a young girl and you hope you have access to birth control. Young women, I should say, not a young girl. You should, and that's something you got to worry about.
Right.
If you should accidentally get pregnant, you got to worry about. It used to be no problem, just take a pill. Now it's kind of like, oh, this is a big deal, Right. So, and I'm not saying, I mean, I have my own personal opinions. You probably can figure out where I come down on this issue. But if we're just talking about people having to be concerned, that is a very, and the boy, everybody talks about the women, but I mean, one reason I got married when I was a sophomore in college was because I wanted to have sex, and I didn't want to get a girl pregnant. Mm-hmm. And so I thought, well, how do you have sex and not get a girl and if she gets pregnant, it's no big deal. You get married. Right. So I knew my first wife 6 weeks.
Wow.
Yeah, dumb. Well, not dumb, because David and Rob wouldn't be here and my 4 grandchildren wouldn't be here.
Right.
But I mean, so it's kind of like your dad, if you think about it.
Yeah.
Right? Kind of like, okay, I need to make these decisions. I need to go to school. A lot of guys went to grad school. I didn't. I went to grad school after I got out of the Army. But a lot of guys went to grad school because they were, like I told you, example, I told you earlier, a lot of guys went into teaching because they could avoid the draft.
Right.
It affected people's decisions.
Well, yeah, and it feels to me like, everybody talks about you had COVID, but back in my day it was AIDS.
Oh yeah.
There's always seems to be something that you have to deal with, and that's why I always feel like the idea of only living in the future and forgetting the past is a problem, because if you remember what happened last time and how they dealt with it, you can sort of try to apply it this time. And I feel like that's one of the things that a lot of people that just sort of shift all that off, and I feel like that's a big mistake.
I agree 100%, Andy. In my generation, it was polio.
Right.
Like, the reason I'm a big vaccine advocate is because you catch polio from poop in the water.
No, and I got family members that had polio. I mean, they were
my mom had
they were my grandparents' relatives and stuff.
Wow.
But if you don't, here's the other thing is that
you couldn't go swimming. That's the point I was going to make. My mom wouldn't let me go swimming. Well, if you're a 10-year-old kid, you live in Las Vegas, Nevada, you kind of want to go swimming, and you couldn't because they're afraid you'd catch polio. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that it's interesting because when you eradicate something like polio because of a generation living with it, and then you cure it, what happens when, now that it's been cured for a while, now people forget what that means, and so now all of a sudden you're starting to have an outbreak of polio again.
Yeah, measles.
And measles and all these stuffs that was gone long ago, and it's sad because it's just so weird. Why?
So my brother, we were traveling.
Well, technology has changed the process, and so people are freaked out about the change of the process, and yet that means we now can actually break down the DNA structure all the way down to everything, which we couldn't quite do before.
My brother caught, you're right, I agree. My brother caught whooping mumps. Well, we now know that if you catch mumps, you can be sterile. They didn't, back in the days, they'd have chickenpox parties,
right?
Measles parties, So he got the mumps, and my mom said, "Oh, let's just give everybody the mumps." So we were driving. My dad was being transferred to the Korean War, and we were going to live with my grandma, who lived in Portland.
Oh wow!
And my brother got the mumps, my younger brother. So my mom rotated us sitting next to him so we could all catch it. I mean, that's how people thought, man. It was so backwards.
Yeah. It is interesting. I find it, I feel like I grew up in a time frame in where the world is, where I have a little foot in the past and I have a little foot in the future, thanks to Nick DeWolf, you know, and folks like him, that I kind of had a shot into the future. And so it wasn't until I got here in Aspen and started playing with the computer that I really understood what Nick DeWolf why he was so jazzed about all that stuff, you know? Yeah. But I feel like it's interesting because even in animation, I learned how to paint and puddle and do all the stuff, traditional old Walt Disney style stuff that they used to do with the acetate cells. And I actually got into the computer because it was so much easier. I didn't need the space to dry all the cells. I could tap and fill and change colors real easily. Before, I'd have to do one whole color all the way through just the shirt of that one character. Then I have to go through and do all the pants, and I have to do all the skin tones and all the hair. And each one was a pass, and it would take forever. Whereas with tap and fill, it was like, I could color everything. So I started to see the future, and the new tools made it a lot easier. But the one thing that I've always found to be true is you still need to understand how it works the old school way, so that you could figure out how to use the new tools to replicate that, or to change that, or to
that goes all the way back to the calculators in math class. You could have a calculator, but you still had to learn how to add, multiply.
And they wouldn't let you use it. They wouldn't let you use it on a final and all that. You couldn't use the calculator.
No.
Not in our day.
How silly. Wait, so when you go out in the real world, you're not going to use your calculator?
Right.
But, and AI is it's going to be so hard.
It's a game changer.
Well, you know what? Again, with AI, what's really interesting that I see from looking at it from my perspective is that it's like a lot of things. I use the analogy of a gun because the reality is a gun can feed a village or it can kill a village. And I think AI is almost
a good analogy.
It's almost the exact same thing. Bad intent will get a bad result. Good intent could actually exponentially be great.
Oh yeah.
But again, it's the person who's pushing it, because AI won't do anything until you tell it what to do.
No, I understand that. I just kind of suspect that Mr. Putin, for example, is sitting around thinking,
right.
And she and
yeah, that's the problem, George.
Let's see here. How can I interfere with the American election?
Yeah,
that's the problem, and it's not just Mr. Putin. It's Mr. Bannon, and it's Mr. Miller, and all these.
Oh, you're right.
Goes that
it's anybody
want to relive the Weimar Republic, and
When Trump talked about the guy in the basement, it could be the guy in the basement. I mean, you don't need a high-end computer machine to be able to do that now. That's the whole, there's a lot of kids. It's funny. I hire to try an interview for kids, and it's very interesting when you try to get them to use the computer, because so many of them now use the little iPads or their phones, because their phones and their iPads do everything. So that actually getting them on a computer, Windows, and how does this work? It's weird. It's weird that that's even an issue, because I would assume they grow up with both.
I look at it as though we've come to a point in our society where we have the equivalent of the Library of Alexandria in pockets, and 90% of America does nothing but look at boobs and cats. That's the extent of what they use this amazing tool, That's where we are,
Well, I grew up with my mom's artwork, so I don't need to look at that anymore.
I mean, we're all guilty. I mean, who doesn't like cats, right?
Yeah.
Or boobs.